think tank.
Many people interested in foreign policy have told me when they come to the Indian Council of World Affairs in Sapru House, they feel a great sense of affinity with this institution because this was where the serious study of international relations in India all began.
The ICWA was set up by a small group of public intellectuals some years before our independence, because they felt it important that India have an independent perspective on international affairs. Since then, the ICWA has gone from strength to strength, and it has been a long journey, almost 75 years. One particular milestone in that journey was in 2001, when the Indian Parliament passed an act declaring the ICWA to be an institution of national importance. We thus became a publicly funded independent think tank. Our governing council is headed by the Vice President of India, and the External Affairs Minister is its Vice President. We have 3 focus areas. The first is research, which is carried out by in-house faculty. Very rigorous research on different parts of the world, encompassing the domain of area studies.
The Council has been very proactive in conducting dialogue and discussion on African affairs and India-Africa relations in order to promote an understanding on African affairs in India, an Indian perspective on Africa, given the priority that now Africa has in Indian foreign policy.
Within the Council, we have a renewed focus on Latin America and the Caribbean region. So we're looking through our studies to find new areas of cooperation such as renewable energy, climate change and the space technology.
Interacting with leading experts, diplomats, media persons and academicians has helped me nurture my research further.
We recently had the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, which has a lot of convergence with the India's own Indo-Pacific construct.
The learning curve at the Council has been tremendous, and it provides a strong foundation for my future research.
The second is policy. Because we are a think tank, and being close to policy, commenting on policy, and helping formulate policy is an essential part of our functioning.
I think in the new age, what we're seeing much more of is that people want to be involved in foreign policy thinking. They want to have a voice. Now, this is where ICWA comes in.
This is the platform where I, for many years, have come and interacted with the best in the world.
ICWA provides a valued platform for visiting foreign dignitaries to interact with informed Indian audiences. The third is outreach. This is most important because of our role as a public-funded independent think tank, and we carry this out by associating ourselves with as wide an audience in India as is possible. Colleges, universities, other think tanks, and of course, with similar institutions elsewhere in the world.
What I would call the democratization of Indian foreign policy. It has moved to distant corners of the country. It is no longer a preserve of Delhi.
ICWA has a robust publications program which includes papers by the in-house faculty, invited papers and commentaries, and books on foreign affairs by not only former diplomats and established academics but also by upcoming scholars. Our journal, India Quarterly, is being published since 1945. ICWA's publications are also being translated into various Indian languages. What is ICWA's role as we move into the future? The vision of the institution is to stay abreast of all the momentous changes taking place in the domain of foreign policy. New areas are emerging. There are strategic technologies, there is climate change, there is artificial intelligence, and there is cybersecurity. How can our research faculty and the audiences that come here be better informed about developments in these areas? How can we write and formulate research papers to give policy inputs that help in government policy formulation? These are the emerging challenges for ICWA and form a part of our vision for the future.
Yeah. Shall we start?
Yeah.
Shall I start?
I'll begin, ma'am. Wait. Okay. I'll introduce you. Wait. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all to the second day of the webinar on Women in Power, Gender within International Relations and Diplomacy, jointly organized by Indian Council of World Affairs and the South Asian University. We will now begin with the fourth session, titled Gender, Security and International Relations. The session will be chaired by Ms. Aruna, former Director, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel National Police Academy. The first speaker of the session is Dr. Swati Parashar, Director, Gothenburg Center for Globalisation and Development, Associate Professor, Peace and Development, School of Global Studies, University of Gothenburg, Sweden, who will be speaking on UNSCR 1325 and the WPS, Old Narratives, New Methods. The second speaker of the session is Dr. Swarna Rajagopalan, Founder and Managing Trustee, the Prajnya Trust, Chennai, who will be speaking on Complications and Questions, Feminism, Gender and Security. The third speaker is Dr. Shweta Singh, Senior Assistant Professor, Department of IR, South Asian University, who will speak on In Between Epistemic Traps and Disciplinary Diktats, Thinking Feminist Security Studies Differently in India. The last speaker of the session is Dr. Shalini Chawla, Distinguished Fellow, Center for Air Power Studies, New Delhi, who will be speaking on Gender, Security and International Relations. This will be followed by a discussion in a Q&A session. I take this opportunity to mention some house rules. All speakers and panelists are requested to mute themselves when they are not speaking. Questions will be taken during Q&A sessions. Panelists can ask questions to the speakers live through raise hand option. Questions can also be asked by registered attendees live by typing through chat box. This will be visible to all the panelists. Questions must be kept brief and to the point. In case you're facing connectivity issues, you may switch off the camera and continue in audio mode. I now request Ms. Bahuguna to kindly conduct the proceedings. Ma'am.
Thank you, Ankita. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to congratulate the ICWA and SAU for conceptualizing and successfully organizing this webinar. I would also like to thank Ambassador Raghavan, I see he's not yet come, and Dr. Ankita Datta for the effort you have put into organizing this. The theme Women in Power is at the core of all human relations and our collective consciousness, but has unfortunately gained traction only in the last 2 to 3 decades. The preceding panels, we have explored how gender analysis can contribute to a better and deeper understanding of diplomacy, development, and human rights. This panel, which I have the privilege of chairing, will deliberate on gender and security, an aspect that has been central to the discipline of international relations since its inception and an important concern of feminist IR scholars. The timing could not have been more appropriate, as this month we mark the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the landmark UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which categorically recognized the key role of women in prevention, protection, participation, and conflict resolution, and galvanized the women, peace, and security agenda. But not long ago, peace and security was literally a womenless world, to borrow a phrase from the feminist scholar Peggy McIntosh. The varied experiences women and their role were summarily ignored. A famous few women who did break the glass ceiling were acknowledged only if they behaved and became like men. Women were only seen as victims needing protection and not as genuine partners in conflict resolution and maintenance of peace. Yesterday, when I was listening to some of the speakers and they were talking about society being patriarchal through the ages, I thought I'll just read out a little bit from an excerpt from Homo sapiens, which now all of us seem to be quoting everywhere, Harari. He says, true, a handful of women have made it to the alpha position, such as Cleopatra of Egypt, Empress Wu Zetian of China, and Elizabeth I of England. Yet they are the exceptions that prove the rule. Throughout Elizabeth's 45-year reign, all members of parliament were men, all officers in the Royal Navy and Army were men, all judges and lawyers were men, all bishops and archbishops were men, all theologians and priests were men, all doctors and surgeons were men, All students and professors in all universities and colleges were men, all mayors and sheriffs were men, and almost all the writers, architects, poets, philosophers, painters, musicians, and scientists were men. Patriarchy has been the norm in almost all agricultural and industrial societies. It has tenaciously weathered political upheavals, social revolutions, and economic transformations. Egypt, for example, was conquered numerous times over the centuries. Assyrians, Persians, Macedonians, Romans, Arabs, Mamelukes, Turks, and British occupied it, and its society always remained patriarchal. Egypt was governed by Pharaonic law, Greek law, Roman law, Muslim law, Ottoman law, and British law, and they all discriminated against people who were not real men. So the myth of protection that persistently marginalized the role of women in security has been thoroughly deconstructed. The correlation between gender inequality and a society's propensity for civil or interstate conflict is now well established. The normative and operative frameworks relating to WPS agenda have considerably strengthened across the UN system since the adoption of 1325 resolution. There is no doubt that women's presence raises awareness of women's issues in conflict situations, helps prevent sexual exploitation and abuse of the local population, and improves operational effectiveness. Despite considerable progress in many areas of the WPS agenda, women are still missing from the negotiating tables and their concerns are neglected in peace process. Attacks on women and violent misogyny are on the rise, and sexual abuse continues to be used as a tool of war and terror with impunity. Justice and reparations are still a distant dream for survivors. From citation basis in IR academia to all male panels or manels in security discussions to gender imbalance among diplomatic corps and security experts to entrenched cultural norms, the obstacle to women's voice in peace and security remain formidable. The 2015 global study mandated by UNSC and its follow-up study by UN Women throw some stark facts and figures that set the context for our panel discussion today. Only 9% of negotiators and 3% of personnel in UN peacekeeping missions were women in 2015. As on 2019, women still make up only 4.2% of the UN blue helmets. At least 1 in 5 refugees or displaced women experience sexual violence. Less than 20% of peace agreements signed between 1990 and 2018 included provisions addressing women, girls, or gender. Only 2% of total bilateral aid to fragile and conflict-affected situations goes directly to women's organizations. Despite commitments, less than half of UN member states have adopted national action plans and strategies on implementation of WPS agenda. The global share of parliamentary seats held by women continues to hover around 20 to 25%. There are some others, but I think I'm exceeding my time. While the issue is vast because of paucity of time, the panel will focus on 3 important aspects. First, on the intersection of gender and security and how feminists view security. Second, what are the rights of women in conflict situations and what role women can play in conflict resolution and reconciliation. And third, what is India's position and contribution to the WPS agenda. Today, it is well recognized that peace is not mere absence of war. Security is multidimensional and is not limited to containing physical violence or confined to the state. Security is political, economic, social dimensions as well as ecological dimensions and involves individuals as well as the state. The panel will explore how feminist perspectives have facilitated a move away from a traditional militarized concept of national security to focus on civilian safety and protection from all forms of threats and violence. India supports the WPS agenda and is committed to play an active role in its implementation. It is ironic that Netaji's INA had an all-female Jhansi regiment, but it took the Supreme Court intervention in independent India to allow women in active military combat. Nevertheless, the first ever all-female formed police unit to be deployed by UN in Liberia was from India. It became a role model for the local women to participate in policing and also inspired many other member states to follow. I'll try to cut short. In the end, we should all remember that the true value of the WPS agenda is its potential for transformation rather than just increasing participation of women in existing military paradigms of security. Gender and security is about preventing war, not about making war safer for women. It is about breaking gender hierarchies and achieving genuine equality, an essential prerequisite for sustainable peace. After all, how can peace be sustainable if we ignore half the population? With these remarks, I open up the panel discussion. Ankita has already introduced the members of our panel. So I think we will start with Swati Parashar, who is joining us all the way from Gothenburg. So over to you, Swati. The queen, yes. The floor, the mic.
Thank you so much, Aruna ji. I think that's a very fitting introduction to the discussions that we've had and also what we will talk about today. But of course, it's important to recognize the work that South Asian University and the ICWA have put together. Ambassador Raghavan, Professor Chaturvedi, your colleagues, and all of you together putting such an important collaborative event together. And I know that in some sense we are all inundated with digital events, but not often are we together at a forum to discuss issues that really matter to us. And that too when we are spared all male panels or manels, which Aruna ji just mentioned. So it's great. Ankita and the organizing team deserve our thanks, and I'm sure that you will keep hearing this throughout the sessions, different sessions today. It's been amazingly seamless technological hand-holding that you have provided us. It's really wonderful. As I said, we are all coping with different digital platforms, so it's important to get help along the way. And to all the inspirational people yesterday that we got to hear, and to the many young and curious who were asking questions, I'm sure that all of us are grateful for this show of community, to realize that there is still an interest and, there's so much commitment to feminist causes. So it's a really welcome event in many sense. And the panelists today, many of them throughout the day, and this particular panel, some of my favorite people on it, and I look forward to the discussions. So a lot of issues came up yesterday, but for me, the big takeaway was that perhaps there is still a huge gap in how we imagine and do feminisms in the different worlds that we inhabit. And I refrain from calling it a local global dissonance, because the local is very much the global. What happens here in India or in Gothenburg or in different parts of these countries, these cities, it is very much part of the international. But much continues to be lost in translation. And I think valuable insights from the history of Indian feminist struggles, as Vibhuti Patel pointed out, Seema Narayan, Asha Hans, we got a glimpse of how much work that has been done. But it also occurred to me that there needs to be, a sustained focus on some of these issues, some of these discussions that are happening in parts of the globe that gets then erased from what we call feminist IR. And I actually was struck by the presentations yesterday, because many of them traced genealogies of feminist IR. But it occurred to me that there was very little insight from the region itself. And I think it's very important to remember and acknowledge the works of Carol Cohn, Cynthia Enlow, and Tickner, Lily Ling, so many others. But we forget the richness of feminist works that we have in the region, from so many interdisciplinary feminist works in India to all the great research in the neighborhood, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal. Very important to acknowledge that. And I'm also saying this because while thinking through my comments today, I recall a paper that a young scholar from India had presented at the International Studies Convention in the last few years, and I was chairing that session where this the paper was on the whole concept of arranged marriages in India, deep anthropology, really well done, good interviews. And it was really stunning for me to realize that not a single Indian feminist had been cited there. There were, of course, references to all possible European or American feminists, many of whom haven't worked on arranged marriages on India. So I actually asked this young scholar, why is it that you cite everyone but, scholars from our own region or activists or so much good work that's gone in? And her point really stuck with me, and it still stays, that the idea that, I want to build a career in feminist IR, and therefore I have to cite feminist IR people. And I think that's a discussion that we can continue to have. So in some sense, I would say that we are guilty of building canons all the time, making the mistake of privileging voices and work that is out there, work that we have done for several years within our own spaces, gets kind of erased in many ways. So with that in the background, I want to focus my intervention today on the discussions around the Security Council Resolution 1325. And this is obviously, we have heard enough to know that this is one resolution that is most researched, argued, embraced by the wider community working with women and children and with gender issues. And of course, there is a lot of global enthusiasm for it. We will literally complete 2 decades of this resolution. And it's considered extremely critical to acknowledge the role and suffering of women in war and the absolute necessity to include them in peace talks and in what is widely known as post-conflict rebuilding and reconstruction of societies and communities. And as we know, the resolution does not stand alone. There have been a number of other initiatives by the UN. It's part of several other resolutions. And of course, the CEDAW Convention, the different conferences that have been held. So it's part of what has now become the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and now almost in some sense like a global norm. We also heard from Professor Hans how the vision was to focus on overall well-being, equality of women, of gender equality, and within the relief and recovery that was envisaged. And we also got a glimpse of the ways in which other members of UN, particularly from Africa, were thinking. And Shomita Basu drew our attention to the focus on men and boys as part of this resolution, which inspired it. So in any case, on paper, this looks in sync with the times, a very modern, if you like, progressive resolution that is talking about gender equality, that's taking gender concerns seriously, and it's weaving it or trying to weave it into policy at the highest levels of global governance, apart from including it at the grassroots level. What we have seen since it came around is how much space, intellectual space, it has occupied. Numerous books, articles, journals, special issues, funding initiatives, particularly in Western countries, research grants, competing centers of excellence, network communities. All of this has been set up following 1325 and the WPS agenda setting. And in fact, the Swedish feminist foreign policy launched in 2014, and Canada's Feminist International Assistance policy launched in 2018. They also draw from 1325 and it's the wider WPS community, prioritizing gender equality and human rights among the domestic constituents and audiences abroad. And of course, we have talked about the National Action Plan. We will hear more about what India is doing in that regard. So all of this have led to conversations about the salience of gender equality in peace, conflict, and development issues, right? So it looks all very good. It's important to talk about these things because not always have we had this kind of extraordinary attention on gender issues. For me, the problem is different. I wish to draw attention to the erasures and marginalizations that this resolution has engendered in both discourse and practice. And I'm here not so much interested in discussing what the resolution contains, what its history is, who participated in the discussions, how it was discussed, and what the resolution actually contains, to do a discourse analysis of that. But I'm interested in what is being made of it and how it is being translated into action, and most importantly, by whom and how. And it is here that I come to my first point, which is about how it links to some of the debates on gender equality that we need to think through very carefully. Post-colonial critiques, we learned yesterday as well through different discussions, they provide insights into the production of knowledge about and by the other, right? And how unequal power relations determine how and whose knowledge is validated. We all know about knowledge being power, but power being knowledge too. So the entire intellectual economy of WPS privileges, from where I am situated, normative whiteness, where white Western feminists have occupied virtually every space where the action is. They command resources, they claim expertise and advance theories to understand conflict cases outside the global north. And I'll come to a specific example that I have from Australia. The Global South in the WPS agenda is definitely mentioned. Of course, we've had discussions, we've had writings on the role that Global South countries have played in this agenda coming to the fore. But in terms of how it is being discussed in different spaces, more as it mentions as a set of case studies, sites of conflict marked by developmental deficits. And the absence of gender equality, and I put that in quote because gender equality is a very fraught term and we can endlessly debate on it, but it is being liberally used repeatedly to highlight in the WPS studies and policy papers to justify that things are, terrible out there, and gender-sensitive training programs, interventions, debates need to be organized to think about ways in which 1325 can be implemented. So it is important to note that these feminist experts deploy gender as a category of analysis without its intersectional meaning and engagement with local context. I insist that there is still very little research that goes on in terms of conversations between, activists on the ground, people on the ground, and what is being discussed at wider levels. My second point is that this is a troubling arrangement of knowledge production where resources are made available to global North institutions and feminists to instruct women and societies out there as in Global South, whose experiences and knowledge systems are at best sources of information, not frameworks of analysis or modes of collaborative learning. In several studies of 1325 and WPS, if you just glance through the literature, there is hyper visibility of conflict sites, such as Myanmar, Indonesia, Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Democratic Republic of Congo. So there's, picking up of these particular sites as sites of conflict, going there and just sort of implementing some of the wider expertise that they claim to have. The case studies do not require any understanding of the context, and also that expertise can be easily mobilized from one conflict to another, depending on the focus of the funding agency or research institution. So for one grant, you are an expert on Asia. You can do work on South Asia, India, if you like. For another, you can effortlessly move to sub-Saharan Africa. And I think this division of labor, where Global North feminists study conflicts and peace processes out there and offer recommendations about the implementation of 1325, whereas Global South activists and feminists and all the networks, they serve as collaborators, either data gatherers or norm takers. There is a certain coloniality in knowledge production that I want to emphasize here. A related third point that I have is of the underlying civilizing mission at the heart of some of the ways in which WPS is being discussed. Again, I want to keep emphasizing that I'm not, here engaging in a discourse analysis of what the WPS agenda, what the different resolutions say and how we understand them, but how it is being translated. And a suitable analogy that came to my mind was of Catherine Mayo's book, right, Mother India, 1927, And little would she have imagined that the book's dark and ominous portrayal of a colonized India would continue to find resonance in the understanding and representation of the post-colonial world in the 21st century. And we know the story, how she was an American author, travel writer, and she kind of was helped enormously by her British friends and hosts. And she wrote a scathing account of Indian masculinity, the widespread disease and ignorance, the religious fault lines, how women could never find emancipation in society here, which was very backward, and how there was need for modernity to be brought to the women to rescue women. We did talk about rescuing the brown women from brown men, alluding to Spivak. And the religious conflicts existed simply because neither Hindu nor Mohammedan could think in terms of the whole people. I mean, these are direct quotes from her work. Why am I thinking about her? Because there are two aspects that Mayo alluded to, of lack of gender rights and equality and the inevitable nature of religious fault lines among people incapable of looking beyond their immediate interests, which with the two of the things that she talked about, in some ways gets reflected and reproduced in the ways in which WPS work is being done, particularly in Western contexts. And Mrinalini Sinha, actually, in her analysis of Mayo's account, brilliant analysis, talks about how she was aided by the US business community, the Rockefeller Foundation, the US government, the British government's foreign office, those days the colonial government, the government of India. So there were all of these people, including individuals, prominent women who belonged to the aristocracy. They helped her put this together. And this kind of pattern gets, in some sense, it gets reflected in the way you see this scramble to establish the efficacy of WPS in bringing gender equality. This is a term that I've often run into discussions with my colleagues, whether it is in Australia, the US, the UK, or even in Sweden. What is it when we say that we can bring gender equality? How is it that we superimpose that without those conversations that feminists in these parts of the world have had for years? So this leads me to the fourth point that I want to emphasize, which is the role of the state. And I think we talked about it in some sense yesterday. The liberal states which are appropriating this kind of agenda setting, or rather, feminist commitments behind it, who see themselves as champions of gender equality, like their predecessor colonial states. Civil society actors, including feminist activists and scholars, often cooperate and collude with states. The state has an overwhelming presence in the WPS agenda and Resolution 1325, not just in terms of individual national plans, but through grants from government agencies, through state-led interventions and efforts regarding WPS, and also for outreach activities, right? And as critical feminists, we are inclined to see both sides of it. We are suspicious of the state. We recognize its oppressions, its militarism and violence. We are also aware of the significance of state in contexts where basic human rights, including rights for women and gender minorities, are still dependent on state legislations and implementation agencies. And again, we talked about it in what Soumya Uma said yesterday, Ashtahan, Seema Narayan, all of them alluded to this kind of, tensions and how we look at the state. Because we interact with the state in myriad ways through all the things that, all the grants and through even our networking with local organizations and outreach, in some sense, it has mushroomed a gender expert industry, which is very problematic in how it upholds it upholds statist agendas, and I think we need to think about that a little bit carefully. My fifth and final point is that we run the risk of ignoring and marginalizing all the good work that is already done in the field of gender, peace, and security with the hyper visibility of some of these concerns. And here I just, in preparation for this talk, I don't actually do discourse analysis of the 1325. I'm looking at more in terms of how policies are enacted. What are the conversations happening in the field? What is it that academic events focus on? So what is it that feminists are writing about? When I see all of that, it really is something to be said that there is a complete erasure of work that is that I find that is already done, or perhaps not alluded to in the same way that it could be. And I spent some years teaching and researching in Australia, and Australia is a very good example of how, the violence against women activism took on from, the case of Rosie Batty, whose story you might be familiar with, how her son got killed, her husband killed her own son, her ex-husband, and finally that happened in 2014. She becomes this big figure in Australia, raising her voice against this kind of violence that's almost 30%. That might be, between 27 to 30% of Australian women have experienced violence or some kind of abuse. These are really huge figures. And since 2015, when she was appointed the Australian of the Year, it took on the cause really became big. Meanwhile, the National Action Plan in Australia has existed since 2012. We didn't hear much about it. And even when you do some of the analysis now, look at the literature that the government has produced with the help of feminists, most of it it recognizes violence. If it recognizes violence in the case of Australia, it will mention to you that it's important to recognize multiculturalism. Of course, there is violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, but we need to think of female genital mutilation, forced marriage, trafficking, dowry violence. It mentions also because that's what happens in the South Asian community. So it picks up, these cases which it believes are coming from migrant communities and denies this space for perhaps a wider discussion of how white masculinity plays a role in all of this. So there's kind of reflection of that. And there's for the lack of time, if you look at some of their documents, I mean, the last NAP document that the government produced, Department of Foreign Affairs, it's a picture of, so it's all of it is that conflicts are out there, and we have a role in these conflicts to, fix things and do our best. And so the picture is of Afghanistan. And, and Australian soldiers who are there. And it kind of makes you think as if, there are no problems within Australia itself, to think about NAP as something that we can apply out there to become part of the wider community of states which are holding these rights. So these are some of the issues that we have to really think about as we think about as we look at 1325. 1325 has taken up so much space and visibility that we need to recover feminist histories, or as Subbalakshmi said, her stories that we continue to erase, her stories that are not so dependent on statist paradigms and mainstreaming normative vocabularies and institutional legitimacy. And references were made to Swedish feminist foreign policy, maybe a new vocabulary in the context of the West. By the way, in Sweden, we criticize that a lot because it's not all hunky-dory as it is presented to be. But some of us would like to argue that feminist practices and objectives are retained in foreign policy in different parts of the world without using that language. And it is also, if you do an analysis of South Asian context, even men have upheld some of these, feminist policies, and we can talk endlessly about it. So finally, has 1325 and its corresponding women's security agenda, peace and security agenda, become an intellectually profitable neoliberal industry that needs to decolonize itself before it is able to make substantive progress in changing the lives of women who are the real risk takers and trailblazers? I would say yes. And to remind once again of the fact that feminist struggles in the global South include challenging both, in India as well, both patriarchies that are local patriarchies in the plural, and epistemic violence of the global North that continues to be visible in so many ways. So decolonization first requires self-reflexivity, alliance building, and subsequently takes blood, sweat, and toil. We might be ready only when we have realized the full dangers of this ongoing colonization of ideas and practices using feminist arguments, and which feminists are complicit. So that is what I have to offer in terms of my critique, and I will be very happy to engage with questions later. Thank you for the time and attention.
Thank you, Swati. That was a good summing up of 1325 and the analysis, especially the role of the state, how we are still dependent on the state, how this is becoming an industry, a mushrooming industry, the risk of ignoring earlier work, ignoring our own work, the intellectual space it has taken up. And anyway, let us hope that it leads to better gender equality in the future. With that, we now go to Dr. Swarna Rajagopalan, who is the founder and managing trustee of the Prajnya Trust in Chennai. She will speak on the complications and questions in feminism, gender, and security. Swarna?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conference, ICWA and South Asian University. Sapru Place is a very special place. Sapru House is a very special place in my heart because I heard about it as a child. My mother, who worked in Delhi in Nehru's India, would talk about it as a very romantic, special library to which she would go. And then when I grew up and grew old enough to come, I did that in my turn. So there's something, it feels very personal to see the revival of ICWA in Sapru House in these times, and I'm really delighted. I also want to say that this has been a very special gathering for me because yesterday, to use a very Indian idiom, I heard two of my akkas, Vibhuti and Asha, speak. I mean, these are people I have grown up reading, following, copying, and Asha not so much grown up, but she's very, very important to me. And I also get to be with three younger scholars whom literally, I think I can say with affection, I have seen grown up, Swati, Shweta, and Shamita. So this makes it a very special conference for me. And before I start, I want to say that I've structured my paper, which, true confession, is very remotely related to the title and abstract I hastily sent Ankita. And in fact, I think one of the things I can now teach is how to write a non-committal abstract. The paper, the presentation is structured around fictionalized stories about insecurity, violence, and deprivation. So I want to put out a trigger warning. If you think you're going to be upset, then you might want to tune out for another 10 minutes or so. I hope not. So in the beginning, there was the state. Sometimes it was a kingdom, sometimes it was a republic. It was marked by someone who ruled, someone who obeyed, taxes paid for protection, and the state defended itself against other states. In our imagination, we efface the internal details and dream like the fortresses and the cannons and the cavalry turned into billiard balls that moved around intelligently maximizing their chances of survival. Survival was only possible at the expense of other billiard balls. And we were locked into a zero-sum universe that led us to strategies like mutual assured destruction. As the science behind weapon systems grew more and more complex and costs escalated, ever smaller numbers were involved in discussing their creation. Security justified secrecy, but it was assumed that you needed technical expertise to speak of these matters, an expertise that most of us don't have. The more esoteric defense and security discussions became, the further they were removed from the lives of people, ordinary people like me. So where am I in this story? This is really where my journey with these issues can be said to have begun. In 1993, a group of us were lucky enough to attend one of the earliest non-formal confidence building workshops in Pakistan. And we, at the end of the whole day, we would talk about non-proliferation and ballistic missiles. And at night, some of the women would hang around in one of our rooms and get lots of chai and talk about life. And we would wonder why there was a disconnect between us. I mean, intellectually, we were all smart enough that we could keep up with discussions, but why was our heart not in that? Why were we not seeing ourselves in those conversations? And we would try. When we were talking, it was about safety, water supply, communal violence, the right to choose, the right to fall in love. all of those things. And then in the daytime, it was about completely different concerns. And we tried really hard to connect ourselves as young, upcoming scholars, writers, media people, administrators, to this other discourse. And it didn't really go, but wherever we went, each of us took this conversation and these questions with us. At another regional workshop 3 years later, and the wonderful thing about these experiences, and anyone who's had them knows, is actually everything that happens outside the official conversation. We put together an anthology going out of that, which featured women as refugees, as Track 2 regulars, as militants, as space holders for resistance, as individuals seeking out survival and safety in the form sometimes of healthcare in their everyday lives. And over the decades, we have told each other countless stories, ours and others, lived, learned, read, from here, from there. For instance, all of those things you heard as a child, don't go out in the dark, come home early. Some of us grew up before cell phones. So come back before it gets dark. Don't go down that road, there are no street lights. Don't walk into a room alone, leave a door open behind you. Or people who talked about flight, fleeing your village, burning in the dead of night with your children into the unknown. You don't know, what's behind, you don't know what's ahead. You have a choice. You have a border security person who's going to send you back to that burning village, or you get into a camp and then you start making deals with the person who says, oh, I can give you your family rations, but you have to sleep with me. Or you're a teenager in a joint family in a 3-bedroom flat where 4 siblings with their wives and children and grandparents all live, and there is no space secure enough to keep you safe from lecherous eyes and wandering hands, and nobody you can talk to. Private contractors set up barbed wire outside your village because your government has acquired the lands that you used to grow, that the forests from which you foraged for your livelihood. You're afraid of the security guards, you're afraid of the people building the fence, you're afraid to send your children to school, and you don't know what you're going to do once the land is completely built on, because where will you then get your firewood, get your food, get what you take to the market? Or going home after years in a refugee camp to realize nobody's alive in your family, nobody has survived that knows your exact address, and everything that you remembered has gone. So how do you go back and ask for your old house, which is no longer maybe in existence? So someone asks you for proof, and what do you do? The stories keep coming. And you take them with you from one seminar to another, from one project to another. You write them down, you tell them. Feminism ingrains in us that the personal is political, and so we learn to look at the details. I mean, this is not about Swati. Initially, I was worried that I would be following all of you high-powered academic people. You exactly set up the stage for what I want to say, because really, where do you leave these stories behind? This work that we do is actually about our lives. So take this giant wave that rises and devastates the coast. I live in Chennai, so the wave is always in my head. Beyond the numbers dead, the property destroyed, you take note of the orphaned girls who are married off early. In fact, this supposed COVID shadow pandemic, which for some reason surprised everybody. Why would you be surprised by the rise of domestic violence unless you've been completely tone deaf your entire life? Why? Early marriage, trans people who can find no shelter that will accept them, no bathroom where they can bathe, who are left out in the cold, people who watch the news somewhere else and say, well, what if this happens to my village? The gender lens actually shows us the faces of those we generalize about. It challenges us to think about who we listen to, who do we let speak for others, whose voices do we amplify? It points out who is vulnerable, highlights who finds agency and survives anyway. And then, of course, we make a whole thing about resilience to the point where people don't want to be recognized as resilient anymore. It compels us to yield and cede to each person the right to speak their reality and therefore to define security. And when we do, the ordinary people of the world, which is almost all of us really, we worry first about food in our stomachs. This summer we have worried about water to wash our hands in for 20 seconds because we can't take that for granted. We worry about what our families will eat 1 week after we receive our salary. We worry about the cyclones that destroy our groves every year. We're still investing in things without thinking about the impact of climate change disasters. And we know that if we lose our coconut and our cashew year after year to cyclones, we will not live long enough for the groves to recover. We will die of starvation before. We worry that if one of us in this small chawl apartment with 8 people catches COVID-19, the rest of us will go down like 9 pins and there will be no one. So the first definition of security is survival. And somewhere in the, I'm not saying the other things, somewhere in the large narratives, we keep forgetting how immediate that still is. We haven't all, and if any year should have proved it to us, it should be 2020. We haven't crossed over to some mythical place where we can take survival for granted. Where the personal is political, the primary level of analysis and the most important referent for security studies, and this is me doffing my hat to my abstract, is the individual, the human, the citizen, the person. This person has a context. And in fact, many contexts, multiple identities, family, several kinds of community, culture, nationality, common experiences of these, and common humanity. So after decades of storytelling, and there is an early stage in your career where you prepare a lot. And then there's a lovely intermediate stage where you can wing things because you're doing them all the time. Then you reach my stage where you're so worried that you'll be incoherent that you over-prep. So for 1 week, I've been redrafting this. And I think what I want to say, because I don't know what I want to say really. I work and live in this liminal area between academics and, what would you say, dhobi ke ghat ka, yeah? Na ghar ka na ghat ka, dhobi ka donkey. Okay, so I'm a little bit like that. I'm not an academic. I'm not an academic. What is it that I really want to say to you? I want to talk to you about three gaps. I think this field has been around for about 30 years. I tend to think of it as sort of finding its first expression in the 1988 millennium issue. So say for 30 years in academics, for about 150 years out there in the women's movement, there are three gaps. One is a gap between critical feminist writing on security and the world of those who make security policy, whether as leaders, diplomats, or the military. The second is that while you still see more women within the security establishment now and in senior positions, we don't have a critical mass of women in this sector. Women and other visible gender minorities. I want to make a point of saying that because we're not even counting women yet. So when will we get to counting everybody else and making it safe for people to come out? The third gap is actually the one where I think, as I write this, I realize this is where my work every day is. It is the critical gap between those who make decisions and for that matter, those who frame the issues as academics, and those who have to live with the consequences of security policy. This is actually the one that I feel that I'm most in danger of being incoherently angry about. So let's talk about the ivory tower and the citadel. There are many ways to tell the story of this field, and as I said, I would anchor it in transnational women's activism and sort of the kind of writing that emerged in the late 80s academically. But in these decades, we've gone from asking activist questions in academic guise to mainstreaming this critical subfield so that it has its own journals, its own jargon, its own seminar circuit. Even the most establishment think tanks now have someone writing on gender. So I did a quick unscientific scan of some of Delhi's think tanks. And the kinds of topics they pick up are digital security, a little bit about livelihood maybe. That's pretty much it. Sometimes there's something here and there about safety, because let's not talk about safety yet. So this is a milestone conference, and you really epitomize this, given that ICWA and South Asian University are both projects of MEA. The fact that you are having this conference on gender and international relations makes it a milestone, but then what does it mean when the establishment embraces, and then I don't know whether to say adopt or co-opt, a critical school of thought? I have some questions about this. Does the mainstreaming into academia of a critical field make it less accessible because of the language, and therefore reinforce the same old hierarchies in a different guise? You know? And Swati, you totally set this up for me. Thank you. White authors from Western academic institutions are still cited more often than others. And even though some of the newer journals have debate and conversation sections, they're still not accessible. I mean, you still have to get someone to download the PDF of the conversation for you. So then what does it actually mean? And then I say, well, if it's on Swarna's blog, it's not as valid as if she had published it in X journal. So where does that leave knowledge creation, debate, exchange between all of us? That's one question. The second one is of the dilution of the critical and political nature of feminist writing on security. You know, I mean, as you can hear from it always, this stuff is personal, no? Because it is about somebody's real life. It's not that you can sit on some sort of pedestal and stage and say, this is my pronouncement on it. But where is that, why does one so rarely hear that anguish, feel that anger? Why are we losing it? And you look at the kind of work that think tanks do, it's all technocratic. You know, it's whether Niti Aayog produces a paper or ORF does. I'm clearly getting very angry about my own paper. They sound the same. Where is the activist element that created this subfield in the first place? And then, okay, all this has happened. Has the mainstreaming actually shifted any thinking? Now, last week we made a presentation at the UN, 2 weeks ago, about India's achievements on the Beijing Plus 25 platform. Now, for some reason, I've not been able to access this speech, just read the reports of it. But I think it's safe to say, and you don't have to be working in the area of gender equality, sorry, Swati, to be saying that, in fact, we do a very bad job with gender justice. We really do. I mean, we can list out a bunch of schemes and then we can deconstruct from here to eternity. You don't even have to go very far to deconstruct. We have not internalized any of this discourse that we make speeches about, you know. And on the question of security, even traditional security, we still subordinate gender justice to a fictional idea of national security. We will not ask questions. I mean, this is an old trap that we constantly, that states and movements fall into. Yes, gender equality, justice sab hoga, but first we will achieve our nation, our state, our security. Well, you know, tomorrow never comes. Tomorrow never comes. So, in short, we have a great distance to go before any of this stuff, 1325 CEDAW, actually becomes real. The second thing I want to talk about is standing on the outside still. I looked for numbers yesterday. Ambassador Khobragade talked about how nobody does work in this area, but there are no numbers. I looked for them. There were very few. I couldn't easily find in the public domain how many women in the police, how many women in the IFS. I'm going to have to dig a lot more. But this is now not a new thing. For 20 years ago when we put the clearing and the thicket together, we couldn't get people to write chapters on women in intelligence, women in army, because they couldn't find numbers. Same thing. Apparently about 20% of candidates selected in the UPSC are women and 18% of the IFS is women. I didn't even look up the military and so on. But the Parliamentary Standing Committee in 1993 had 4 out of 30 members women. And in 2017-18, 2 out of 20 from the Lok Sabha and 2 out of 10. So again, 4 out of 30. So it seems to be some sort of parliamentary MEA committee quota. We've had people in leadership roles, but leadership roles are not what transform the culture and thinking of an organization. It's a critical mass in the rank and file. And we're very far from having that still. Feminists push for improving numbers to the point of parity, and then they also say that we need to sensitize men. This is why one part of 1325 is participation, but a good part of the other WPS resolutions is actually about sensitization, training, human rights, and so on, spreading those ideas and mainstreaming them. The last thing I do want to talk about, and I'm not keeping track of time, something I've learned from my male colleagues over the years, is actually this question of whether we are citizens or subjects of security policy. You know, if the individual is the final, ultimate, core referent of security, if it is the human being, then what are we? Are we citizens who should engage? Or are we subjects who should say, my bap, you know best? So I think Aruna ji is trying to tell me my time is up, but I'm going to ignore her for a moment. And talk about this thing, you know, feminist IR generally, history generally, ignored women for the longest time. We were not there. Let's not talk about other gender minorities yet. Then we showed up in the second half of the last century as victims. Then for a while, we examined our misery in conflict, misery in crisis, misery in everything. And then slowly, as feminists began to push back, we began to uncover agency. But then, where are all of us as citizens, men or women or trans people, where are we in these conversations about security? Not just manuals, not just conferences. You know, I have the privilege of having grown up in a place where traditional conflict was distant, Bombay, and I now live in a city which has been neighbor to conflict in Chennai, but not really a conflict zone by the standards of what we know. I think these are important issues nevertheless, and I want to talk about them. But the truth is, daily life leaves people with very little time for anything that doesn't affect them. Will there be water? Will there be power? Will my small salary reach till my child's school books have to be bought? There is no time to be thinking big questions, learning technical details. And so the first task for a peace educator is, why should you care? Why does this? And working with a gender lens actually helps you break down a larger situation and look at how it affects individual lives. And that, I think, is one of the most powerful things you do with a feminist take on security. Second is the sense of alienation that people feel on security issues. I will.
Interrupt, please. Because, can I interrupt, please? You've exceeded by almost double your time. So can you wind up, please?
I have learnt well from my colleagues, but I will then close by simply saying that citizens matter because citizens are at the core of this work. As long as we skirt around that, we are not talking about this. And restoring voice is critical to feminist agendas. And therefore, we come back to the question of citizenship. If there is nothing international about this, then I suggest to you that smashing analytical binaries like inside, outside, domestic, international is a good way to practice smashing patriarchy. And really, if we are not talking about everyday survival, justice, freedom, we are not talking about security. The rest of it is just nice. It's nice to be on the circuit. But on that note, and I do apologize for taking up time because I know it means that Shweta and Shalini will have to rush. But what can I say? I learned from the best.
Thank you, Swarna. Thank you, Dr. Rajagopalan. So that was a good, from the heart, I think you spoke the history of security, what the fears that women and the trauma they go through. And I think ultimately, yes, women have to face this double burden. And this potential, I think, can be realized only if we really reimagine peace building and the role of women. It all needs to be reimagined, as you said, deconstruct. So with that, we go to Dr. Shweta Singh, a senior assistant professor from the Department of IR of South Asian University. Shweta, who will speak to us about in between epistemic traps and disciplinary diktats, thinking feminist security studies differently in India.
Thank you so much, Aruna ji. Where do I start? I think at the outset, a big thank you to Ambassador Raghavan, ICWA, and the team led by Dr. Ankita Datta, and definitely our very own chair and Dean of Faculty of Social Sciences, Professor Chaturvedi, for really bringing this conversation and facilitating this collaboration with ICWA. So when I was thinking about, and I think both Swati and Swarna have set up a formidable stage. I think I cannot go that pathway. And when I was thinking about what is it that I want to talk about today in the context of epistemic traps and disciplinary diktats, I think I went back to my training as a historian before my training as a student of international relations. And I think that's where I would be coming in, trying to draw a conversation between historicizing the trajectory of feminist security studies in India and the genealogy of FSS, of feminist security studies in the discipline of IR. And in doing so, I think I pay attention to, and I do that consciously, I pay attention to what is called the geography of knowledge, John Agnew, and what Enloe would say as navigating the local and the everyday in search of the global. We've had many conversations, and colleague on this panel did point out that, I am actually bringing in citing two scholars from the global north. And I do that consciously, because I do that consciously to establish a trajectory that I would unfold in the following few paragraphs, or in terms of the field. Now, what am I trying to do here? I think what I'm trying to do is I'm curious to understand the sites of knowledge production, and more specifically, shift the gaze. When I say shift the gaze, I also say historicize the gaze. Now, why am I doing this? Because I think till the time we look into history, I think Swarna talked about it, how women have been ignored in history. There's the politics of historiography that we need to recognize. And I think till the time we dig deeper into history, we cannot understand the stories of epistemic marginalization, disciplinary diktats, and epistemic traps. In this conversation today, I have three questions that I'll be exploring, and this is obviously work in progress. How do feminist IR scholars break or not break with dominant epistemologies to frame their own sites of knowledge production? What are those sites of knowledge production? How is it different in India? Have we explored those sites of knowledge production in India? In this process, what factors shape their positionality and identity as feminist scholars and activists? How do they conceptualize and interpret women's experiences, so beautifully articulated by Swarna, in their societies? And how has this impinged or not impinged on the global feminist agenda? Has there been an attempt to bring order in an order which can be characterized as feminism's containment in the global South? Now, having said that, I thought, thinking through this, I was fascinated by the use of the word language, or the ideas around language. And two scholars or two philosophers that's fascinated, and I'll build a rationale on why I want to use these two philosophers or their critical thinking on this idea of language, is Mikhail Bakhtin and Gayatri Spivak. I think Bakhtin's work, to my mind, is very fascinating because later on, I will say why we really need to look at the politics of language and how we privilege a certain kind of writing. How do we marginalize creativity in writing? And how does it shape or not shape a security agenda? So if you look at Bakhtin, I think why he's important is because he stresses the crucial importance of language for politics. And I want to lay emphasis on this idea of language for politics. It privileges language as a creative force rather than an empty vehicle for consensus building. And I think this, again, is a very, very valid point because language, Swati was talking about old narratives. Now, what are we looking at it in the context of language? Is the language of WPS used as an empty vehicle for consensus building? So the role of language in that context. Second, I think Bakhtin, to my mind, is important because it insists that cognition and meaning formation as such are intersubjective. And I think the idea of intersubjectivity is very, very pertinent. Third, it stresses the idea of voice, whose voice matters. And moving forward in the spirit, if I draw on Gayatri Spivak, obviously she's talking about three shifting concepts: language, world, and consciousness. And I want to emphasize on the idea of both world and consciousness, the idea of feminist consciousness. Where is it coming from? I think yesterday and today, we've had conversation on contemporary feminist security studies within the boundaries of the disciplines of IR. Somewhere, I'm trying to nudge those boundaries. I'm trying to locate the beginnings of this field, not in the defined boundaries of IR. I am saying that the conversation doesn't begin in 1988. Maybe we did not recognize, maybe the conversation needs to be taken or you need to push back in terms of historical timeline. And that's an important point because many a times the vocabulary that is being used, let's say post 1988, that very idea exists in historical canons. So are we going to marginalize those voices in that context? So coming to the specific context, I think I was very fascinated by the work of Professor Imtiaz Ahmed. And why I thought his work was important when I was trying to look at historicizing this case is because he makes an important point in the context of the whole context of methodological diversity and for making the methodological quest local. And when he's talking about making the methodological quest local, he actually draws in and he underlines how colonial systems has practically robbed the South Asians of their knowledge of their indigenous philosophical traditions. And I want to emphasize here, how is it that we marginalized indigenous philosophical traditions, including, for instance, knowledge of Indian dialectics. For instance, drawing on the Prasangika as a method of dialectics. How do we go back to Prasangika and the Upanishadic thought that we are talking about? So while writing this paper, I was doing my research to look into it, I actually found compartmentalization. Compartmentalization in terms of disciplinary boundaries. There's a lot of work in the context of women in ancient India, women in medieval India, women in colonial India, but this work is not in conversation with other disciplines, specifically like IR. And I think that is a question that perturbs me because I think that kind of interdisciplinarity has to come in when we are trying to actually build a genealogy of the field. Now, so for instance, I thought a key characteristic of feminist security studies research in the Indian context and broadly in South Asia is actually marked by three different Ds. And I think 3 different Ds are interesting to my mind. These 3 different Ds are dialogue, difference, and dissidence. And I think I can trace the roots of these 3 Ds, dialogue, difference, and dissidence, in terms of the process of historicizing this gaze itself. So when I look at ancient India, and I want to go into ancient India, and as I said, I'm just beginning my journey here. I'm curious. I'm really curious. When I looked at ancient India, I was curious to pick on strands of feminist philosophical or feminist political thought or feminist philosophy. And I would say that, I traversed a lot, and I think where I came and anchored myself was on 2 bodies of work. One is the Upanishads or the Upanishadic thought, and the other is the Therigatha, drawn from Buddhist canonical literature. And I think the Therigatha stands very, very under-researched as a Pali canonical text. Now, if I'm looking at it, there's been a lot of conversation in the context in the recent past, and colleagues and academics have been researching, for instance, on the whole idea of strategy, the whole idea of dharma, the whole idea of order. But all of that is anchored onto a text, for instance, like Kautilya's Arthashastra. Now, I was wondering, is there absence of a canonical text that can put forth an alternative imagery of the idea of dharma, the idea of order? And I recognize that this is not a reductionist argument. I recognize that texts need to be situated in the context of histories that we are talking about, in the context of patriarchies that we need to recognize. But in that context, what is that alternative normative imagery that we need to explore that stands under research? So, for instance, when I looked at the Therigatha, now the Therigatha is a very interesting Buddhist canonical text. It is an anthology of 73 poems found in Pali canon, composed by Theris or elder women. And I think that was very interesting. When I started exploring this was an interesting point for me. Now, the gathas or the songs impart significant details of early Buddhist life. 3rd century, 6th century. Now, while they give you the stories around Buddhism, the shaping of Buddhist thought, what is it being mediated by? It is mediated by experiences of women who are writing this. And I think that's an important point. So when we are looking at the Therigatha or the Theris, the elder women, I think 2 ideas really strike me. The Theris or these women are writing about grief. They're writing about sorrow. They're writing about karma. And in the process, they're also giving you insights into the politics of the state in the 3rd and the 6th century BC. Now, what feminists currently, within the body of feminist security studies, classify as continuum of violence, if I was to dig deeper in terms of history, I would find resonance in these ideas in such texts that we are talking about. Now, why are we not exploring these texts? Why are these texts not being privileged in the context of analysis that we as IR scholars or we as feminist scholars would do? The second thing I would say is we need to look at these sites which actually conventionally are not recognized as legitimate sites for the field of international relations. So the politics of knowledge production. What is valid knowledge? Whose knowledge is valid? Why is it knowledge? Why is that valid? How is it legitimized? And obviously, this is intricately connected to the marginalization of women's voices, both in the writing of history and in the writing of international relations. I think the politics of historiography needs to be brought into place at this point of time. Further, I think a closer reading of Therigatha points towards the idea of heterogeneity and diversity. We are talking about the frames of intersectionality. This idea of intersectionality, this idea of diversity is something that we can actually trace back to the 3rd and the 6th century. For example, where did these women come from? What was the socio-economic background that they were part from? What was the kind of experiences that they were bringing in? The idea, what I'm trying to say is that this is not absolutely a modern phenomena. It's a modern coinage. Now, in that context, how do we trace that genealogy? Further, if I go, something that strikes me is In terms of my limited historical skills, when I saunter again in the period of ancient India, I want to draw attention both to the idea of dialectics, for instance, embedded in the Upanishadic thought, more specifically the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which contains the lengthy account of Gargi's dialogue with Yajnavalkya. Now, why is that dialogue important? I think that's important for an understanding of the politics of dialectics, the politics of erasures that Swati is talking about. Similarly, we also need to understand the politics of language. In what language is this being written? Sanskrit and Pali, something which we would recognize the kind of predominance that it would have. But I think if you look at Susie Tharu and K. Lalita's work, and that's where I said we need to go local and understand the geographies of knowledge, I think Susie Tharu and K. Lalita brings forth a compilation of women writing in India 600 BC onwards. In fact, the significance of this work is it retrieves 2,600 years and what can be classified as a feminist oral subaltern tradition. I think that's something that we need to draw as feminist IR scholars from the historians, from the feminist historians, from scholars of literature. And the interesting bit about this feminist subaltern tradition and this particular compilation is that it doesn't stop with Sanskrit and Pali. In fact, it brings together 13 different languages and writings from in 13 different languages. For instance, Bengali, Gujarati, Kannada, Malayalam. And I think that's the idea in the context of the geographies of knowledge that we're talking about. And I want to reiterate the point that if you're looking at the evolution of the field, and that's why I say that even within India, it's not singular. It is in the plural. And I think it is time that we, as scholars and activists, recognize why we need to historicize our gaze. Why is it that this area remains under-researched? And moving forward, obviously I bring into examples from ancient India, but there is a lot of work, for instance, again, going back to this idea of strategy, going back to the idea of alternative imagery. I think we need to understand feminist contributions, for instance, of Meham Anga, Razia Sultana, Rudrama Devi, Chand Bibi, Umabai Dabade, Savitribai Phule, Fatima Sheikh. And why is it that they have been invisibilized in our narratives? I think there is a stronger need for what Kumari Jayawardene calls an ideological revolt and a break from the older order in the spirit of dialectics rooted in indigenous philosophical systems. In fact, Kumari Jayawardene draws attention to feminist consciousness and a need for critical and self-reflexive account of feminism, in the spirit that there is no one singular feminism in South Asia or in India. And this has to be read in the spirit of dialogue, dissidence, and difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shweta. That was very insightful, especially the 3Ds, dialogue, difference, dissidence, and the local examples, the local language that you gave, the importance of interdisciplinary studies. I think now we are running against time. So I will now go to Dr. Shalini Chawla, a distinguished fellow. Yeah, can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shalini Chawla, distinguished fellow from the Center for Air Power Studies, New Delhi, who will speak to us on gender, security, and international relations. Over to you, Dr. Shalini.
Thank you. Thank you, Aruna ji. Thank you so much for setting the stage so beautifully. I really enjoyed your introductory comments. I will begin by thanking ICWA and Ambassador Raghavan for inviting me to speak on the subject, which is very close to my heart, although I'm not a gender studies specialist from any angle. And I'm delighted to be part of this discussion. I really compliment ICWA and South Asia University, Professor Chaturvedi, for bringing this all together and steering this debate on this issue. Thank you, Ankita, for being a wonderful, host and absolutely flawless coordination. Very, very smooth. So thank you to you and your team. So much has been said, I don't even know where and what I'm going to be adding. Swarna ji's, I was very, very moved by Swarna ji's detailed account of how she kind of very passionately brought about the question of survivability And obviously, Swati laid a beautiful ground by talking about 1325 and WPS. And Shweta has covered the history extensively. And what I was most struck when she said her limited knowledge of history. So I think I really admire that humble attitude, Shweta. So my compliments on that. What I'm going to be doing is when I was thinking, what am I now going to write and talk on the subject? I have been working in the national security think tank, in a military think tank. It's the Center for Air Power Studies, which is supported by the Indian Air Force. So we interact quite a bit with the armed forces. So my narrative here is more from the perspective of a defense analyst, a female defense analyst, scholar on the IR and security studies, and the challenges one would potentially feel. I have been in this field of international security and defense analysis for 20 years now. But although in any field, we all know that to excel and to get recognition, one needs to put in extra efforts and energy with dedication for sure. But I must confess that in the field of defense analysis and research in international relations, being a woman, one needs to go much further to prove her credentials. Recognition does not come easily, not only from the male colleagues, but also from the female colleagues, incidentally. And women scholars or practitioners are, I think, continuously battling the fact that there are women and vulnerable sex and they need to prove themselves. Now, the webinar is obviously happening at a very apt time, as all of us agree, to commemorate, it's commemorating 20 years of Resolution 1325. Also in 2020, the global community marks the 25th anniversary of the 4th World Conference on Women and Adaptation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action 1995. And thirdly, a 5-year milestone has been reached towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So certainly, this is a very, very pivotal year to reinforce and accelerate efforts towards gender equality and women empowerment all across the globe. We have seen the horrifying face of conflict and how over the last 20 years, there have been multiple other dimensions which we see in conflict around us, which show women as the prime victim of war and conflict, which Swarna ji talked about in detail. We see now, when we see the examples of women will obviously crop up out as victims. We saw in Pakistan the case of Malala Yousafzai, who fought for the right of education and was shot in the forehead. Then in Afghanistan, Sharbat Gula, a very, very famous green-eyed girl who was orphaned at the age of 6 during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. She had trekked by foot to Pakistan with her siblings and grandmother, and became an instant icon in June 1985 when she appeared on the cover of National Geographic magazine. So when we are talking about women as the prime victims of war, and what we see now, right now at present going on in Afghanistan, where hard-earned women freedom and rights are on stake. In case we see the last 25 years, we all see how women suffered. They were subject to brutal violence and how they came back to regain their lost liberty and dignity. And there are now serious efforts by the Afghan state and very deep concerns from the international community to retain those rights and liberties of the Afghan women. Now, Ms. Fazia Kofi, the Afghan politician who was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, I heard her for the first time in ICWA only when the institute hosted role of women in Afghanistan, a dialogue on that. She at a personal level, her example really fascinates me, because at a personal level, she's lost a lot in the war, but that has definitely not shaken her passion to go ahead and drive this whole women empowerment drive in Afghanistan. She has faced an assassination attempt, and then she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So we see a contradiction where on one side she was tried to be silenced, and on the other side international community recognizes her role and contribution. Now, the session poses some extremely relevant questions, and I'm going to be discussing these in the next 10 or 12 minutes, because I presume that's what I have. And I'm going to be talking more from the perspective of a defense analyst and a scholar working on the IR. So whenever we talk on women and security and conflict, the most reference point, as has been reinforced, is victim. Now, the direct consequence of the conflict is impact on women from rape, harassment, displacement, girl-child marriages, the issues that they go into refugee camps, losing their husband, taking a completely different role in their life, being the bread and earners now. But still, when it comes to studying IR or war and conflict studies, there is a lack of women representation, even though we have seen that the numbers enrolled in the subject has relatively gone up. I don't have like the exact percentage, but with my experience of years where I've been going to many universities to give talks, I have seen and spoken to the faculty. So there is significant number of enrollment of the women students. Now, traditionally, war and conflict and securities have been seen as a man domains. And when we see our history and our Indian mythology and history, I think Shweta has done a wonderful job. So I'm just excluding a lot of points from the talk which have already been covered. Now, this relates to our patriarchal societies that have been there. And unfortunately, the narrow thought process still reflects in the disparity that is seen in women being underrepresented in the security studies, defense analysis, and subsequently to critical decision making. So to an extent, there is an historical linkage to the whole issue, and then we have biases and perceptions where women are seen as gender which might not be able to handle the concept of war and security, the technicalities of the subject. That's what I have felt being a scholar and in this field where I've worked in a very, very male-dominant environment in the armed forces. So as far as the numbers are concerned, some figures I have and studies suggest that 70% of the faculty in international relations is. And if we see the numbers in PhDs, even in the top institutions globally like Harvard, women comprise about 2%. So there is this deficiency, but if we see India, this deficiency has another aspect to it where we don't have the subject of defense studies or international relations in large number of institutions at the higher level. It is limited to restricted cities and then restricted institutions. So we have seen a rise in the number of girl students who enroll. Also, we see a good number of scholars working in the think tanks like ICWA is a fantastic role model. And then the institution that I come from, 50% of the scholars are women. But what is saddening is that a very small percentage actually sustains in the field and then a smaller number makes up to the senior level. That's the sad part of it. So it's kind of a vicious circle where women are underrepresented in the profession and they lag behind the male colleagues. And there is a serious, I would say, definitely a challenge of marginalization in the profession. For example, there is a natural resistance which one can see in even applauding the research or writings of a female scholar, or for that matter, even citing of female scholars. So a lot of research shows that the female scholars are cited much less, and it has already been spoken in the session. And specifically, if you attempt studies on doctrine and strategy, which I have done, I know, I mean, it is a very, very tough task to kind of prove yourself. But you can do it. It's not impossible. That's what I can say it with conviction. Now, to exemplify this, recently there was a debate on China hosted by a very popular TV channel with over 50 China experts, all men experts. Now, this is not believable that India doesn't have female China experts. And the channel was trolled badly for hosting a panel. And the moderator of the show, who was a woman, justified this by saying that the panel was being moderated by a woman. Now, we have many such examples in the field of IR and war studies where female scholars are perpetually struggling to defy those traditional notions of men being better thinkers or commentators on the subject. And the feminist interventions certainly are very important in the security studies. And why they're important, I have three reasons and factors that I want to bring in. One was in some ways touched upon by Aruna ji in the beginning, first and foremost, and the very obvious reason that by having a male-dominant interventions on peace and security, we are actually using less than half of country's potential. So inclusivity is critical to be able to utilize the full potential of a state. As it is, in the field of peace and security is attempted by a fewer number of people when compared to the multiple other more popular and maybe monetarily lucrative career opportunities. And now if we choose to sideline feminist thinkings and interventions, we are actually relying on a much smaller numbers to think and analyze the critical issues of conflict and national security, which form the foundation of the state and determine a nation's potential for overall development and growth. And this reminds me a quote from India's ambassador to US, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, when she was asked that how does it feel to be world's feminist #1? And she replied, and I'm quoting her, "I'm not a feminist. As far as I can see, the question of being male or female has nothing to do with the duty of both sexes to take part in the world affairs." Now, second factor is women's entitlement for equal rights and opportunities. So to actually deny them the opportunity because of the historical, cultural factors and the perception of being seen then as a weaker sex is unfair. Feminism, according to the dictionary, is defined as the belief in social, economic, and political equality of all sexes. Although largely originating in the West, feminism is manifested worldwide and is represented by various institutions committed to activity on behalf of women's rights and interests. Now, this needs to be definitely understood that the role of women in democratic reforms is critical and central to development and stability. And one of the crucial parameters to measure a nation's evolution and growth is to see how women are treated in the country. For that matter, even if we see with a micro lens around us, a family is seen as progressive when women in the family are treated equally and have the freedom to pursue their dreams. Third factor, which is important here, is the feminist approaches are vital for the balanced analysis of important issues of conflict and security. And I feel feminist voices definitely bring out a holistic interpretation to peace and security because there are concerns for women which reflect in their studies for sure. Feminist ideas based on their experience and very importantly, their sensory perceptions will certainly enhance the understanding of various dimensions of conflicts and peace building. After all, women and children suffer a lot and rape is described as the true weapon of mass destruction. And now coming to women in decision making and their role in IR and their role in post-conflict and nation building, I think this can happen through two ways. It happens through two ways actually, although the numbers are less. Women need to be part of, they need to be part of negotiation and peace process. And secondly, women need to be in the decision-making roles, political, diplomatic role, which facilitates their engagement in nation building and reconstructions in the formal structure. The political representation of women becomes essential. And in the data over the last 2 or 3 years shows that a worldwide average of women in parliament is close to about 23 or 24%. Caprioli's data suggests that her study, I was quite impressed by it, that suggested that the number of women in parliament, if it increases by 5%, the state is 5 times less likely to use violence when confronted with a crisis because women are less likely to go for violence and they would rely more on consensus, solution based on consensus build-up. Then according to
I request you to please start winding up.
Okay. Okay. Then the study by the Council of Foreign Relations also talked about the fact that the engagement of women would promote a larger number of conventions being passed much easily. So definitely higher number of women in the parliament lead to a different, dimensions, which the example again I will bring to Afghanistan, where 25% of women are parliamentarians are women. And we have seen that how they have fought for their right, and finally they landed up on the negotiating table, negotiating with the Taliban, which was completely unthinkable in the scenario like in Afghanistan. Then I feel obviously female quality to build a coalition and push for force have been exemplified by many fantastic examples. International campaign to ban landmines run by Jodie Williams successfully signed Ottawa Treaty. Then we had the Liberian peace activist where she worked for ending the brutal civil war. So we have had very, very successful examples in terms of the negotiating skill. And coming to rights of women, conflicts, rights in post-conflict societies and their participation in reconstruction and reconciliation process, I feel that their participation in the resolution negotiation has been very limited. And for a lasting peace, an inclusive approach is essential. It is critical to have strong women representation. And they normally often have informal roles of power, but the roles need to be more formalized, and representation and decision making needs to be there. Poulomi Tripathi, the first Secretary of India's permanent mission to the UN, had noted that the majority of peace agreements signed in the last 3 decades had no signatories. In fact, just 13% of women were negotiators and 4 in the major peace process. So we definitely, that challenge is there, but there is a distinct ability in the women negotiators, which we have seen in the example of Sri Lanka, where Visakha Dharmdasa was actually called to negotiate between LTT and the government and the Norwegian representatives. And then we also have in India, we have very good examples in India of Naga Mothers Association and Meru Paibis in Manipur, who have done very commendable job. So that part definitely is there, and there are examples which have been, can be illustrated. And now I am not saying by these examples where I'm talking about the leadership of women in the peace campaigns that essentially coming of women will completely ensure peace, because there are also examples of women leaders who have been extremely harsh in their decision making, but definitely their representation will bring out a different dimension, which should be encouraged and brought, and discussed and debated. And I think the case study of Afghanistan is phenomenal, where we see how women are fighting for their rights. And the biggest concern right now, one of the biggest concern in the international community is definitely end of violence, but the second is how the women's rights will be sustained in that environment, and how will it go through. Now, what India has done, I think there's no time, there's much been spoken about it, so I will not go into it. But as far as India is concerned, I would say that we have come a long way, and there are conscious efforts that we see in this direction. The number of female enrollment has gone up. At the policy making level, the progress is quite noticeable.
Please interrupt. Can you wind up, please?
The realization that war and conflict are not exclusive space restricted to men is being debated and discussed in India, and this needs to grow and follow in action, and not just be on the rocking chair, or for that matter wheelchair. And to conclude, I would say that in the changing face of security and conflict, women need to be part of the security narrative and part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chawla. I'm so sorry for having to go on interrupting you. That was a very insightful talk by you, how difficult it is. I think all of us have faced this, getting recognition from men and from other women, the horrifying experiences that women victims have gone through, the lack of women representatives. It's good to hear that there are more girl students, and I hope there will be more inclusivity in future. So with that, we'll come to the discussions. There are some questions here. Just a second. The first question is addressed to Swati. What strategy? Swati, can you hear me? Swati?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry, I was muted. I can hear you. I've read that question from Nabila, right?
Yeah, from Nabila, yes. So shall I read
Yes.
out the question for the
No,
others?
yeah, please, Arunaji.
What strategy can post-colonial researchers employ to become more visible in this androcentric hegemony of the WPS agenda?
Yeah, thank you, Nabila, for that question. And in some sense, it's not just about WPS. It's in general that we want to talk about, right? Generally in academia, in places of policy. I would say that we have to think about visibility. Where is it that we want to become visible? And if that is what we want to be, and I think there are a lot of, two things I want to say. One, about setting the terms of collaborations. I know that a lot of us, and increasingly this is going to become the trend, that we are going to collaborate more and more. I think I can tell you that COVID is affecting so much of research, which, people were fond of going to different parts of the world and doing, that we are looking at a world of research where more collaborations will occur. We will have to set the terms of those collaborations. There is another project that I'm engaged in on how credit is given, why Global South collaborators are considered just, data collectors or people who, norm takers who don't actually have a stake. Sometimes they're not even cited from the body of work that is produced outside. So I think we need a stake in that. We need to ask questions of people with whom we are working. That's one thing. And the other thing I would say is that we have to, there's a lot of money and resources that goes in the global north to learn about, other parts of the world. That's my potential critique that I've made, that they do a lot of that. I think in India or in other parts of the world, we are perhaps not that much invested in it. Of course, anthropologists and others are doing it, but within feminist IR, we still rely on, the canonical texts or people who are doing this kind of work outside. I think we have to create our own body of knowledge, and we have to draw what is there in other disciplines. We have to do more ground research. And this is something I'll say for WPS as well. There is so much good work, and I call it that, I call WPS, for lack of a better word, UNization of work that is already there. Do we know the amount of work that feminists in the region through transnational networks have done on women, peace and security? How are we talking about it? How are we connecting to them? And is that work, are we talking to policymakers and informing ourselves a little bit better about what is going on, rather than simply sort of capturing what is happening outside? So I think much remains to be done. And I just wanted to finally to just link this to questions about caste patriarchy that come in later. I think we have to admit that it's not just, the problem is not between, androcentric world and North and South. It's also the conversations that we are having within these networks as well. And I think this is where a lot of angry Dalit feminists say that, and I don't want to use mainstream feminism, because to me, Dalits are as mainstream as anybody else. But the point is that this idea of mainstreaming is so problematic, and they point out that they have never been part of conversations. They have never been brought into intellectual spaces, policy spaces. And I think they are creating their own spaces, and we have to learn to listen. Sometimes they even reject coming to spaces that they feel that they're not welcome in. So we have to learn to listen. We haven't done a very good job of that, perhaps. Thank you, Arunaji.
Ankita, do we have time for one more question?
Ma'am, we have some time. There are a couple of questions that have been addressed to Dr. Rajagopalan. Maybe she can take together.
Okay, one from Dr. Stuti Banerjee, who is a research fellow at ICWA. For Dr. Rajagopalan, how does feminism look at the low-caste women in India? Are they disadvantaged as women from low-caste, illiterate, and as economically poor women? How can they shape, or do they shape, the security agenda, the language of polity and equality? Rajgopalan.
Yeah, there are actually two questions about caste and intersectionality, and I'll just take them together to say that this is actually the problem. The problem is that regardless of where you are located outside of the security establishment, you pretty much don't get to engage with this. You don't get an opportunity to learn about these issues. You don't get an opportunity to discuss. The assumption is either that you are not interested, or that you don't care, or you don't have the wherewithal to understand. Had I not been so extravagant with my time early on, at the end of my presentation notes, I actually had a story from Idindakare, which is where the Kudankulam plant is located, where the villagers saw the news reports from Fukushima and essentially intensified their protests. And who was in the forefront of those protests? It was village women. It was women that you would normally look at and say, oh, they don't know anything, they haven't been to college, they are not engineers. But they were there asking all the right questions, the technical ones, the political ones. And I think the point is that if we, exactly as Swati has also just said, we need to open up the conversation so others can get to ask the questions, others can get to set the questions. And we have a bit of a journey to go from here to there. So that's my short answer to both the intersectionality questions, but no, there's a long way to go.
There's one more question for you, Dr. Rajagopalan. Where is it?
Are you talking about the one from Dhrubajyoti Bhattacharya? Why are these concerns not in the principal discourse?
Why your concerns, survival and security? Yeah, that's right. It's not in the principal discourse in South Asia, other regions. How can that change?
Because we need to be pushing to get it on there. So you, if you are on social platforms, me when I tweet or when I talk, when I come to a conference like this, although this may not be on their original agenda, it is up to us to push and put these concerns on the agenda. And I think that maybe that's like the summary you wish I had used, that in fact, this is everybody's problem and we need to own it. We not wait for someone to give it to us and invite us and give us space at the table, but simply say, look, this is my problem and you're going to listen to me. And these are critical concerns for most of us. So it's up to you and me.
I would like to, my question, so I think this thing that it's a very, very educative for me as a feminist activist working mostly at a local and national level, this international discourse and all 4 presentations. But my question is the feminist scholarship in partition studies, which is done by Urvashi Butalia or Kamla Basin, Ritu Menon and many other scholars at a university level. And also the testimonies, all 3 have written, Mridula Sarabhai, Pushpa Mehta and Kamlaben Patel's Mool Sota Uklera. Now it is available in English also, the uprooted. The sensibilities and the analysis that emerges from that, has it been reflected in the security studies? And I think Dr. Shalini Chawla can also say, is it part of the syllabus in the security studies? Are this scholarship, is it now legitimized in the security studies?
Can I just come?
Yeah.
I have seen these be reflecting in the syllabus in some of the universities, but not very popular. And as you highlighted, they should be part of essential studies. I don't know about the South Asian study, maybe Shweta can tell us better. But as far as the question about them being reflecting in the security studies in terms of how are they being how do we take the examples now? So they are good to study that specific timeline study. They are fantastic studies. But I think as the face of crisis and the conflict and war has changed significantly, and we have multiple other dimensions added to it, I think these are very good studies to draw inspiration and also many reflections associated with the conflict and disputes. But I think lately the new dimensions which have emerged need a lot of thinking, and they demand thinking.
But still there is a continuity in what they were saying and what Dr. Swarna Rajagopalan just now said. So you see there is in terms of the day-to-day reality, the material reality and the insecurity of tenure and all that women are facing. That remains common.
I think with that, we'll conclude this session. I thank all the panelists. All of you have made really insightful comments, analysis on the different aspects of gender and security, and it's really difficult to summarize all that was deliberated today. But I think all of us are going back that much richer. And I hope that the WPS agenda and this, women and security, gender is not reduced to these anniversary events and periodic debates. I hope that, it leads to more concrete action and changes on the ground, some kind of transformation in people's thinking on the ground, people's actions on the ground. We really need to celebrate not just all the first, the first woman this and the first woman that. We need to celebrate more women, as we have just heard from all of you. There need to be more women involved in decision making, in peacemaking, in mediation, in the police, in the military. And I think that everywhere we really need to have a gender lens into all aspects of our work. And gender should really become the heart of socio-economic development. Because without that, all our peace and security efforts and all will really come to naught. And I think that India really can and should take the lead in this area. And I thank the ICWA and the SAU and Pastor Raghavan, who has joined us now, and Dr. Ankita Datta, and yes, all your team, those who have worked behind the scenes also, for all that you have done in putting this together. I think we have exceeded our time, not too badly, but been such a good experience for all of us. Thank you, and thank you all the panelists and all the others who are present here today at this
Thank you, Arunaji, for being a very kind chair.
I would like to thank Ms. Bahuguna for chairing the session and all the speakers for their wonderful presentations. With this, we take a lunch break and we'll join back at 13:45 hours.
Thank you, Ankita. Thank you. Bye.